Enrichment. Points of view. Imagine you live in England in the 1770s. You read in the newspaper about protests against taxes in Boston. You don't understand what all the fuss is about. You pay your taxes. Why won't the colonists just settle down and pay theirs? Then you read about the Boston Tea Party. From your point of view, the Sons of Liberty and other patriots have behaved very badly. What gives them the right to destroy tea that doesn't belong to them? You feel like these so-called patriots are really just criminals. They ought to be arrested and thrown in jail. Now imagine you are a Bostonian opposed to the new taxes. And imagine one of the people killed at the Boston Massacre was a friend of yours. Imagine there are soldiers with muskets all over town watching you. How do the same events look now? They probably look very different. You may see the Sons of Liberty as heroes fighting against a tyrannical king and an oppressive government. Let's try the same exercise again. But this time, let's imagine how things might look if your religious point of view changed. Imagine you live in Virginia and are a member of the Church of England. You go to church every Sunday and try to do what the pastor says is right. You are a loyalist. You have been taught that it is important to remain loyal to the king and the British government. So how can you possibly support the rebellion in the colonies? Now change your point of view again. Imagine that you live in Massachusetts. You are a descendant of the Puritans who settled that colony. You also go to a Christian church on Sundays, but you are not a member of the Church of England. Your church is an independent church that broke away from the Church of England many years ago. Your church does not demand loyalty to the king. In fact, your church was founded by men who stood up to kings. Members of your family stood up to King Charles I in the 1640s, and their children and grandchildren stood up to King James II in the 1680s. Does it seem wrong to you to stand up to King George III? Not at all. On the contrary, it seems like the right thing to do. You believe every citizen has a right to stand up to a tyrannical king, and not just a right, a duty. Now let's imagine that your ancestors did not come to the colonies from Europe. Let's imagine that you are an enslaved African, a person from Africa brought to the colonies against your will on a slave ship. As an enslaved person, what might be your point of view? Which side would you support in the American Revolution? Would you side with the Patriots, even though your freedom was no part of their mission? The American Revolution was about taxes and self-government. It was not about freeing the slaves or ending slavery. In fact, Thomas Jefferson and many of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence owned slaves. They made statements about unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But many did not expect their ideas to be applied to enslaved persons. Despite this, some African Americans saw things from the colonists' point of view and joined the rebellion. Crispus Attucks, the sailor who was killed in the Boston Massacre, is a prime example, as is Phillis Wheatley, poet. She opposed the Stamp Act, and at the beginning of the Revolutionary War, wrote a poem for George Washington. In it, she expressed her hope that Washington and the Continental Army would eventually defeat the British. There were also African American soldiers. African American militiamen fought with the colonists at Lexington and Concord. There were also African Americans at the battles of Bunker Hill and Yorktown. However, some African Americans fought for the British. In November 1775, Lord Dunmore, the Loyalist governor of Virginia, made a proclamation. He announced that any enslaved person who ran away and joined the British Army would be set free. Many did run away and serve in the British Army. Some of these soldiers wore a patch on their uniform that read, "Liberty to slaves." Native Americans had their own point of view about the war, or rather, they had many different points of view. It is misleading to think of Native Americans as a single group. Each tribe had its own leaders, its own history, and its own traditions. Early in the war, colonists tried to convince many Native Americans not to get involved. In fact, the Second Continental Congress sent a message to 6 nations of Native people specifically asking them to avoid involvement in the conflict. Some Native Americans heeded this advice and remained neutral. However, others decided to side with the British. Many of these tribes had fought battles against the colonists themselves, and they thought the British government might help keep settlers from moving west. The British government passed a law that forbade colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. They were to stay on the East Coast. If this law were enforced, it could be a positive thing for Native Americans. It could stop the westward expansion of the colonists, which might mean the Native people would be able to stay on their land. That is one reason Native Americans, such as the Cherokee, fought for the British and against the colonists. Some Native American tribes sided with the colonists. The Mohican, who lived in western Massachusetts, are one example. The Mohican had fought with the colonists in the French and Indian War, and they sided with the colonists again in the American Revolution. Mohican Indians fought with General Washington's army when he surrounded the British Army in Boston. They also served in the army that was victorious at Saratoga. The events of the American Revolution were extraordinary. People from different cultures, different occupations, and different opinions came together to change the course of history. A new nation was formed, and in less than 200 years, it would become the most powerful nation in the world.